Devastating floods, record heat, massive wildfires and drought. We look back on the climate crisis of 2022. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Climate change and the crisis faced by countries across the globe intensified in 2022. From deadly floods in Asia to raging wildfires in the United States and drought in Africa, the warning signs were just about everywhere. Meanwhile, representatives gathered in Egypt for a major UN climate conference, COP27, and in Montreal, China chaired COP15, the UN Biodiversity Conference, where a historic agreement was reached. To discuss all of this, we are joined from Beijing by Changhua. She is CEO of the Beijing Future Innovation Center. With us too from Phoenix is Mahmoud. He is Director of the Climate and Water Program with the Middle East Institute. And joining the discussion here in Washington, D.C. is Sweta Chakraborty. She is President of an organization called U.S. Operations We Don't Have Time. And from Quito, Ecuador, we're joined by Kevin Koenig. He is Climate and Energy Director for Amazon Watch. Welcome to all of you to the show. Changhua, let me start with you. As we look back at 2022, of course, China was again hit very hard by the climate crisis. There were floods in the southern part of the country. How would you assess the overall impact that the climate crisis has had on China this past year?
China was hit again by another round of record-breaking extreme weather events and disasters, sustained heat waves, droughts, and floods. If you look at the costs overall to the economy, it's accounting about maybe 2 or 2.5% of the GDP. If you look at the devastation, infrastructure, energy, food systems, and people's health in the context of a continued COVID pandemic there as well. So the lessons learned in a way that we are literally living in a new normal of almost on a daily basis of extreme weather events. So climate change is happening. I think the whole country has been waking up and also add a sense of urgency to take actions. On one side, we need to mitigate as much as possible to phase out fossil fuels. In the meantime, we have to step up efforts and investment into adaptation. So you started to see a probably united national efforts and a strategy to advance and accelerate action to fight climate change at this moment in China.
Right, so Changhua, China will, of course, as you say, accelerate efforts to mitigate the effects of climate change. But I guess the challenge for China right now is to convince certain other countries to get on board as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, if you look at China's national climate resilience or adaptation strategy 2035, that's already set clear national strategy goals, integrated efforts and investment there as well, from science, R&D perspective to technology to policies, you name it. I think China's performance and behavior has already demonstrated to the global community. On one side, we are suffering tremendously, like many other parts of the world, of the climate impacts. In the meantime, China itself need to take more urgent actions, and very importantly, climate change is a global challenge where China needs to figure out how to work together more effectively with the global community to fight the climate change, particularly actually at this moment, to accelerate the clean energy transition, and more and more so actually to accelerate action or investment in adaptation.
Sweta, Pakistan was also one of those countries that was hit very hard by the climate crisis. Let's listen to that country's Minister for Climate Change, Sherry Rehman.
It's impacted 33 million people, which is, again, just for context, the amount of people in 3 medium-sized European countries. Just the loss and damage is $30 billion.
So, Sweta, are these types of climate events going to get much worse? And how much of a threat do they pose, especially to low-lying countries like Bangladesh?
Human-caused carbon emissions, it's what is actually accelerating glacier melt. It's what's in contributing to heavy precipitation. And both of those together is what resulted in the flooding in Pakistan that we saw that affected over 30 million people. That's caused 30 billion in loss and damages, as we just heard. And this is for a country, Pakistan, that is contributing to less than 1% of these human-made carbon emissions. So it doesn't add up. It's not fair. And disproportionately, South Asia is being affected by human-caused carbon emissions and all the impacts of climate change that stem from that. Bangladesh being one, Sri Lanka, India. A quarter of the world's population is South Asian and is extremely vulnerable to impacts of climate. In India, the heat waves were out of control. It was the hottest March in recorded history in the last 120 years. And at some points, temperatures peaked at over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, these temperatures are not hospitable to human life. Humans cannot farm. Humans cannot safely be outside for long periods of time. It affects our food security. It affects human health, economic productivity. So there's some real serious considerations that need to be made and hard decisions that need to be made that we saw coming out of COP27, out of COP15, that's really going to protect this quarter of the planet's population and the rest of the planet as well, of course.
Sweta, as you say, there were those heat waves in India. It also happened in other parts of the world. I mean, what sort of red flags do they pose for the future?
These are really the canaries in the coal mine. There is a science fiction author that many watching this program will be familiar with. His name is Kim Stanley Robinson, and he wrote a book called Ministry for the Future. And the first chapter was actually initially thought to be science fiction, where a heat wave killed 10 million Indian citizens. But actually, based on what we saw this year, this is becoming less and less science fiction and more a possibility. And it's a possibility we really need to do everything in our collective power to ensure doesn't come into reality. We can get ahead of this. Let's take these red flags and go forward with them and demand policymakers and all the various country delegation heads actually make the tough decisions in the short term to move us away from this warming trajectory that is going to result in more floods if we don't get off of this path that we're on.
Mahmoud, there are parts of the Middle East that suffered sandstorms, and if we look at parts of Africa, there are many countries that suffered a drought. It continues to be of major concern to that part of the world. Looking at these two regions, looking back at these two regions, I should say, how bad was the climate crisis in 2022?
You know, it's really interesting is we thought last year was a banner year in terms of extreme climate events, but this year really pushed the envelope further. Starting in late spring, early summer, as a consequence of the long-term drought that the region was experiencing, we started to see, because of that drying of the topmost layer of the soil, and as regional winds moved through the Arabian Peninsula region, we started to see this higher incidence of dust storm events in rapid succession. Very frequent, very thick dust clogging the atmosphere, occurring all around the Arabian Peninsula. We've seen it in Iraq, Syria, parts of Iran, Saudi Arabia, and down through the Gulf. Then, following that, as summer started in earnest, we started to see heat waves, not just in the Middle East, but extreme heat waves, as my colleagues mentioned previously, across the world, that in turn broke temperature records, as well as led to outbreaks of, or higher incidence of, wildfires. And then to top it off, as the summer moved on towards the early fall, because of the increased warming that was happening in the region, increased warming of the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, that led to conditions that were very conducive for heavy thunderstorm precipitation events that occurred in the southern parts of the Arabian Peninsula. We saw very extreme thunderstorms and flooding that occurred in the United Arab Emirates, Oman, parts of the Gulf and Saudi Arabia. And I would also say it was also one of the catalysts that caused the monsoon activity to ramp up more than usual, that led to all the flooding and rain that was happening in both Pakistan and Afghanistan. So not a great year. We thought last year was bad enough, but we're moving in a very alarming trajectory.
Right, Mohammed, Sweta was telling us a moment ago about the impact this would have on things like food security. She was talking about South Asia, but what about the African continent and the Middle East when you have these kinds of conditions?
Absolutely. I always like to say that water security is food security. Those two things are very much linked at the hip, because we think about it in terms of drought, when there's not enough water, which has been the case certainly in the Middle East and North Africa, and I'd argue because of the warming in some other parts of the world, then you don't have enough water resources to meet all the various needs, of which the largest is food production or agricultural productivity. About 60 to 70% of the world's water resources on average per country goes towards agriculture and food production. So when those sources of water are diminished because of drought and proper access, then the available water to grow crops is also impacted. So very much a serious implication that can amplify in coming years as drought persists and these other climate impacts play a role as well.
Kevin Koenig, great to have you with us on the show. If we look at Latin America, in fact, not just Latin America, there is deep concern across Latin America as well as the rest of the world on the fate of the Amazon rainforest. It is being threatened not just by the climate crisis, but also by deforestation as well. How did the Amazon rainforest fare in 2022?
Well, yeah, I would say, I mean, it was another dire year for the Amazon, right? What we know is that the Amazon is at a tipping point. Scientists are saying that 80% of the Amazon needs to remain intact to avoid dieback and basically become a savanna, and also a net carbon source instead of a sink. And that 80% needs to be protected also to avoid disruption of moisture patterns, right? The Amazon is delivering water, atmospheric rivers to places, as far away as California, Middle East, et cetera. And so it's a vital ecosystem, right? It's an existential threat for humanity, for the planet. There's no safe climate future that involves losing the Amazon. And the facts are dire, right? The Amazon has lost 27% of forest to deforestation and degradation. Last year, well, between July in 2021 and July 2022, Brazil lost an area of forest the size of Qatar. So there's urgent work to be done to repair and restore and halt future deforestation. Indigenous people across the Amazon basin are calling for 80% intact by 2025. That's what scientists are telling us is needed. The good news, though, certainly is that Brazil is back with the election of Lula da Silva and the defeat of Jair Bolsonaro. I think that gives Brazilians and the forest and the world hope. Lula was at COP27 and made it very clear that action around climate change and efforts to end deforestation would be a central part of his administration. So there is some good news in here as well.
Changhua, protecting our biodiversity is, of course, very closely linked to the battle against climate change. We've just had COP15, that conference that took place in Montreal, that was chaired by China. Here is the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres.
Delegates at the COP15 UN Biodiversity Conference in Montreal agreed on a new global biodiversity framework. We are finally starting to forge a peace pact with nature. This framework is an important step for determined diplomacy, and I urge all countries to deliver.
So, Changhua, one of the major agreements was this plan to protect 30% of land and sea by the year 2030. How significant overall was this conference? Changhua, can you hear me?
For instance, the level of ambition in the final framework is not only just the 30% of land and oceans, but also restoring 30% of the ecosystems that are already under destruction. So it's very fascinating to see global consensus, a global agreement that in this decade we're going to really put down our actions and money and put the money where our words are to not only protect nature, to halt and reverse the loss of nature, but also to restore as much as possible. So that's why it's regarded as one of the most significant piece of the global climate or nature governance, so that we'll be able to act together to really reaching towards the harmony with nature by mid of century.
Kevin Koenig, we just heard the UN Secretary General there described that agreement as a peace pact with nature. How much impact do you think that will have on saving the Amazon?
Well, I think it's a great start. Certainly, I mean, this agreement is a lifeline, right, for the planet, for the Amazon. So I think one of the things that I think is really important that we see in the agreement is the recognition of indigenous rights and the role that indigenous peoples play in protecting ecosystems, standing forests, and biodiversity, right? Indigenous people make up less than 5% of the world's population, but they protect 80% of the biodiversity. And I think the accord underscores a need to respect and recognize indigenous rights. And I think it shows a sort of way forward, right? That there is a need for a rights-based approach to conservation if we're going to make some impact in protecting the Amazon and other critical ecosystems around the world.
Sweta, let's talk about that other big conference of the parties. Of course, that was COP27, which was on climate change. That took place in November. And one of the big developments from that conference was agreement by delegates to set up a fund to help developing countries that suffer, quote, loss and damage. What did you make of that agreement?
This was really necessary. It's been long overdue. There's been years of promising the $100 billion to actually support climate finance around the world, to be able to support countries become more resilient to the impacts of climate change, especially those that are most vulnerable. And then one thing that had been missing in all the previous COPs was a fund for loss and damages. So what we just talked about regarding Pakistan, $30 billion in cost related to this flooding. Somebody needs to be able to pay for that. So this loss and damages fund was really key coming out of COP27 to give that support to, again, those most vulnerable countries that probably had very little to do with actually contributing to the impacts that they are currently and will continue to face if we don't immediately get off this warming trajectory that we're on. And so that was a positive outcome from COP. And it was really supported because we're seeing incredible domestic policies come into place that also have been long overdue, but here in the United States. In Washington, D.C. this past year, recently, these past few months, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed by the Biden administration, which is overhauling United States sectors towards a clean energy future with a real emphasis on transportation and electrification of transportation. So the United States showing that it can be done, and then supporting the loss and damages fund, supporting the $100 billion climate finance fund is the game changer that's going to be required. It's going to bring those financial instruments into reality to result in actual real-world interventions, real-world funding, real-world solution support, again, for these countries that are most vulnerable and in dire need for this type of support.
Mohammed, what do you make of that funding structure or arrangement that was agreed to at COP27?
COP27, in terms of the outcome, of course, the biggest of which is the announcement of the Loss and Damage Fund. I mean, that's what stole the headlines, and rightfully so. However, I have some other concerns about other areas of the conference where there was some progress made, but not enough. Certainly when I think about the Loss and Damage Fund, announcing it, making it a reality after many years of demands and claims, rightful claims, honestly, from developing nations and nations that suffer the worst because of climate change, have finally been answered. But one of the questions still to be resolved is the funding. You know, there were some commitments from some developed nations towards that fund, but there's still a lot of gaps to fill in terms of how the full fund will be populated, how it will be administered, how the funds will be dispersed, etc. And the expectation is that between now and the next COP, there's a committee that will come together and try to answer those questions. So I'd still be cautious about full optimism until we get those details. The other piece is in terms of funding for adaptation. The fund that my colleague just referred to, there were some commitments done at COP27, but still not enough and nowhere near what was originally committed to by the nations, the developed nations that were set forth to populate the fund with the money that is required. That still was not substantial. And then the other thing is, even though the Loss and Damage Fund seeks to correct the damages of the past, historical damages to these developing nations, there wasn't enough information and updates in terms of carbon emission reductions and updates to national determined contributions. Those are the plans set forth by different countries. So there's still a lot of work to be done. We did some progress. Certainly the loss and damage was a great one, but there's a lot more work to be done.
And Mohammed, there is one other factor that is impacting the response to climate change. That is the conflict in Ukraine. And on this particular issue, we see 2 points of view, among many others, of course, but 2 points of view when it comes to climate change. And that is, there is one group that believes that the conflict in Ukraine will slow down the move away from fossil fuels. And then the other point of view is that, no, it will actually speed up our move towards more renewable sources of energy.
Yeah, those are very interesting viewpoints on that issue. And I think a lot of that is based on the perspective and ability of the countries to either transition to alternative forms of energy based on financial capacities and access to other forms of energy versus other countries that do not. And unfortunately, it appears to be those that do not are developing countries or countries that are reliant on export of energy from other countries, such as those that were reliant on the energy that's tied up because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But there are opportunities, certainly in the Middle East, to transition to solar energy. Ample land, a lot of solar radiation being absorbed. We're slowly fixing the large-scale, long-term storage of solar energy issue. I think that should be resolved soon for our ability to store energy beyond when solar panels are generating the energy during the daytime. So there are opportunities, even intermediate forms of energy, maybe not as clean, like natural gas or nuclear. But again, it depends on the capacities of the countries and hence their perspective on whether they're able to transition sooner or not.
Changhua, China has been very proactive in areas such as forestation and also in its general push towards renewable energy. What can we expect in 2023 rather?
Well, I think China has made, made the case in terms of, the two fronts in terms of, shifting towards non-fossil fuel energy. In that context, in particular, renewable energy and cleaning up electrification and also actually speed up electrification of mobility, among others there. On the other side, we do need to protect nature because more and more so we recognize the linkage between climate change and nature conservation there. Of course, nature helps tremendously to help mitigate climate change because it's the biggest sort of carbon sink. In the meantime, on the other side, on the adaptation side, actually nature provides this sort of a buffer zones to help us to cool actually the temperature in the various situations there. So China's efforts, particularly at the national level, is an integrated strategy. On one side, we are gearing up to continue to accelerate the clean energy transition, particularly around the renewable energy, wind and the solar. And the clean energy system. In the meantime, we are definitely moving forward to invest in protecting of nature, particularly around planting more trees and protect other critical ecosystems.
Kevin Koenig, looking beyond 2023, and a moment ago you were talking about the incoming Brazilian president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Now he has promised to host COP30 in 2025. How significant will that be for the Amazon?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think obviously it will really show, his commitment, Brazil's commitment, but to zero deforestation, to reaching some of these goals that are laid out in COP15. And, during his tenure, we know that he's putting substantial resources back into the Ministry of the Environment and a lot of domestic policies that are being aimed at curbing deforestation and putting a halt to other activities that are leading to deforestation and rights violations in the Amazon, like illegal logging, for example, and the massive expansion of agribusiness, right, that's happening there. So it's certainly a signal. Again, the proof will be in the pudding here about, by 2030, we'll see where we're at. remembering this issue of the tipping point where, you know, the future of the Amazon is hanging in the balance right now. And what we are seeing in other areas of the Amazon, in the Western Amazon, for example, you have countries like Ecuador that are, despite some of these, you know, commitments in COP15 and COP27 and the Paris Accord, but they're looking to double extraction. Right? There's a dangerous discrepancy between some of the commitments that are being made at COP15, COP27, and what governments and the oil and gas industry are already planning on doing. They're talking about massive expansion of production that would take us beyond scenarios of 2.5, right? So that's also where we really need to look, right? What is the industry and governments planning on doing? Because right now they're locking in extractive fossil fuel projects right now that will be going on and producing oil from underneath standing forests in the Amazon well beyond 2030.
Sweta, talking about tipping points, there was a study done by Science magazine this year which claimed that at current rates, 5 key climate tipping points are already possible, and it also warns about the devastation if we go past that target of 1.5 degrees. That's the raise in global warming. Can we still avoid that?
So this is not a goal. This is a planetary limitation. This 1.5 degrees, which is hard often for audiences to understand, is literally where we max out before it becomes unbearable to be on this planet. It's where we will also see, if we move past 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, we're going to see expedited melting of glaciers. We're going to see loss of rainforests that will become irreversible. It's not the kind of thing that we'll be able to restore in our lifetimes, in the lifetimes of our grandchildren. So we can't get there. This isn't a nice to have. This is a absolutely mandatory planetary limitation, and we can still stay within that planetary limitation. We absolutely can continue to turn the pledges into reality that all the countries made at COP27. It keeps us within this planetary limitation, and it allows us to continue to look forward to a future that is actually clean, that is actually energy fulfilling for populations around the world, that's equitable, that's just. Let's look forward to that and do it together.
Right, and that's where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. It's been a great discussion. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thank you for watching.